Everybody, and welcome to Ideas by Interpreters, episode number 12. Today we have here with us Bosnian interpreter Darko Bartula, who's going to tell us his amazing experiences in legal interpreting and the types of assignments he's done over the years in his career. So Darko, welcome and thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and share your screen and get started.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline, for inviting me to share some of my interpreting experience. Hello, everyone. My name is Darko Bartula. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which once belonged to a socialist federal republic of Yugoslavia, a country located in Central and Southeastern Europe that existed from its foundation in the aftermath of World War II until its dissolution in 1992 amid the Yugoslav fratricidal wars, resulting in creation of what is now 7 new internationally recognized countries. Had it not be a war here, I would have had never become an interpreter. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Darko, if you could maybe just either increase your volume or come a little closer to the microphone. It's a little bit quiet. Other than that, all good.
I'll try my best. Just 1 second. Okay, can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, yeah, we are going to speak about some of my interpreting experience from the legal institutions where I worked. And I'd like to just start with the fact, how did I become an interpreter? First of all, I never really studied English as a major. I just studied it both at primary and secondary school, and after finishing these schools, I was able just to understand English from American movies and lectures in English. However, due to the fact that I did not have much opportunity to openly communicate in English, I was somehow shy to express myself in English for a long time. And that shyness finally ended at my age of 22, when I went to India on a pilgrimage for 45 days. Somehow being forced to, sorry, you wanted to ask me something?
No. It sounds like an amazing experience, and I totally understand the shyness that comes along with learning a new language. It's always the most difficult part to learn oral skills with a language and be comfortable. It's almost like you're acting a part in a way. So yeah, I'd love to hear about your experience there.
Yeah, so somehow being forced to communicate with local people in India, I gained self-confidence to openly communicate with English-speaking people, and finally I gained courage to express myself in English. When I got back home in 1997, I had applied to UN, and interestingly at that time there was a United Nations mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina which needed many language assistants to interpret from one of the 3 official local languages, which are Bosnian, Croatian and Serbian, into English and vice versa. Certainly my interpreting skills at that time were not at high level, but I was young and I was teachable, and I was able to quickly grasp all the required knowledge to be able to do my job as interpreter back then. I only spent 5 years in this UN mission, which basically worked on police reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You may see on this screen some insignia, and in the middle you see IPTF. That stands for International Police Task Force. United Nations was sent here after the war to reform the local police so that they basically serve the people and not do whatever the police in the former communist country was doing. And I'm pretty sure all the audience is aware how the communist system and the police worked. I didn't want to speak much about these 5 years because that was just my beginning of the interpreting career, but I can just say that in the beginning I worked with international police and later with civil affairs section of the United Nations here in Bosnia, And at that point, this mission had about 7,000 UN officers from 96 different countries.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. You must have been very culturally immersed. That's really cool.
Yeah. During that time, I had an opportunity to meet numerous political and diplomatic representatives, and I was involved in discussions of different political and police aspects of peacekeeping. And basically, at this next slide, you may see that almost at the end of this UN mission, then Secretary General Kofi Annan visited us and addressed the UN staff in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That was about the time when the UN mission was supposed to close down in 2000, although the UN mission stayed here until 2003. Here in this audience, you may see my face standing in front of Kofi Annan.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So after that, I wanted to continue working for United Nations because this mission closed down, but there was no many other UN agencies in the theater except for just several, and amongst all, these several, I was quite attracted to the United Nations mission or United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That ad hoc tribunal was created to punish some of the perpetrators of terrible crimes that happened in my country. And I can just share some of these crimes, some of these pictures that were used in the trials of the tribunal. And I'm sure the world somehow learned about these terrible atrocities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1992, 1993, 4, and 5, these war crimes actually were the main reason why the United Nations established this tribunal. Here we can see a marketplace where in Sarajevo people were just buying groceries during the 1994, and at some point a shell landed and killed about 65 people, and you can see the victims were laying down in the hospital waiting for doctors to receive them. These pictures are from detention camps in Prijedor, and when they appeared in the world's media in the summer of 1992 and shocked the public at large, particularly in Western Europe, where they brought back memories from World War II, the public reaction forced the international community to react to reports of atrocities and concentration camps in Bosnia. And that's how these are pictures from Srebrenica. I'm sure most of the audience heard of Srebrenica, the place where the largest massacre and genocide occurred in July of 1995. Many people were forced to leave their homes, and later male members of families were found in different mass graves, and you can see some of these pictures. But as I said, that caused the UN to establish the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Some of the facts you can see on the screen. The tribunal was established in 1993. However, it did not start working until 1995 when the first trial started, and it aimed to prosecute the leaders of political and military establishments in the former Yugoslavia. The ICTY was the first international criminal court after Nuremberg and Tokyo, and it was created as the first contemporary attempt to address war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed in conflicts. In the next slide, I would like to show a video, which is like a 7-minute video, which will basically bring the audience closer to the institution where I worked.
Okay, great. Okay? Yeah, we're going to show the video, and then we'll move on with the rest of the presentation. So I apologize if there's any lagging in the broadcasting of the video. We also may send these with the recorded webinar later on, so you can look more in detail. All right, go ahead, Darko.
Yeah.
I'm John Hocking, the Registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the work of this tribunal and share with you some of our achievements. In the spring and summer of 2011, we announced the arrests of Bosnian Serb Ratko Mladic and Croatian Serb Goran Hadjic. The last fugitives sought by the ICTY were finally in our custody. These arrests put an end to the multinational manhunt for the last of 161 individuals wanted on war crimes charges. This is the largest number of people ever to be prosecuted for war crimes by a single international institution. It also marked a milestone for the world's first truly international court. 18 years after its establishment, the ICTY can proudly say that no person indicted by it can evade justice. As the wars raged in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 1990s, reports of atrocities committed on a mass scale came to light. Serious violations of international humanitarian law were being committed. As the world watched, daily news reports detailing mass executions, torture, rape, and deportation. It became clear that these were not isolated incidents. These appalling crimes were part of an organized, systematic campaign of violence amounting to crimes against humanity and genocide. It was not just soldiers who experienced the terror and suffering of war. Many thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, and civilian men became casualties in this tragic and bloody conflict. An estimated 140,000 people lost their lives. Millions more were driven from their homes. Massive economic disruption meant much of the former country was left in poverty. Political instability prolonged an atmosphere of fear and misery. The international community was compelled to intervene and ensure that these disturbing crimes did not go unpunished. On 25th May 1993, the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to establish the ICTY to try those believed responsible for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, violations of the laws or customs of war, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
This will be no victor's tribunal. The only victor that will prevail in this endeavor is the truth.
Nearly 20 years later, this tribunal has irreversibly changed the landscape of international humanitarian and criminal law. We've dismantled the impunity of heads of state, military and political leadership for war crimes. Finally, rank and position could not serve as an excuse for evading responsibility for the crimes that happened. We've also brought many criminals to justice, as evidenced by the guilty verdicts handed down in the Krstic case regarding the massacre at Srebrenica.
Bosnian women, children and elderly were removed from the enclave, and between 7,000 to 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men were systematically murdered. Sentences: Radislav Krstic to 35 years imprisonment.
We've given voice to over 4,000 witnesses through their testimonies.
But to kill the wounded that cannot defend themselves, who have no arms, it is terrible. It is a crime that has to be punished.
Tens of thousands of hours of video recordings and millions of pages of documents from our courtrooms provide an undeniable and positive legacy for generations of students, scholars, and ordinary citizens to come. Furthermore, factual findings of our trial chambers will contribute to the making of a historical record about the events that irrevocably changed the region. Our primary function is trying individuals for war crimes. The ICTY has also served as an incentive to authorities in the former Yugoslavia to reform their judiciaries. It's been a catalyst for the creation of specialized war crimes courts. These and other courts across the region have and will continue to benefit from the tribunal's experience and legal expertise. We're actively working in partnership with legal professionals from the former Yugoslavia. We're assisting them in dealing with war crimes cases and enforcing legal standards in their local systems. The tribunals also transferred several cases and numerous investigative files to national authorities and courts, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but also in Croatia and Serbia. The ICTYs made an invaluable contribution to international jurisprudence. The tribunal's judges and staff have extensively shared their expertise with those involved with developing other international courts. The International Criminal Court, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone have benefited from our efforts. We've proved to the world that justice can work. This tribunal has been a pioneering institution, setting a large number of important legal precedents. The ICTY has enforced a general prohibition of torture in international law. We've made significant advances in international humanitarian law pertaining to the legal treatment and punishment of sexual violence in wartime. The tribunal has specified crucial elements of the crime of genocide, in particular the definition of the target of this crime. Part of our mandate has been to contribute to a lasting peace in the region, and through the ICTY's outreach program, we are actively making our trials and judgments accessible and understandable to audiences in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. To conclude, this tribunal has given notice to would-be perpetrators of crimes against humanity, be they foot soldiers or heads of state, that these crimes will not be tolerated and that they could find themselves in front of an international criminal court to be held accountable for their actions. From our first pioneering steps to the day that this tribunal closes its doors, the work of its dedicated professionals will resonate in courtrooms, classrooms, and war rooms. Thousands of trials will be heard by domestic courts carrying on the work of the ICTY long after its last judgment has been rendered. Bringing war criminals to justice was our mandate. The triumph of justice is our legacy.
Okay. Are
Great,
we there?
thank you for that video. It was very, very informative, yes. I guess next slide is, yeah.
Yes. So, after giving an insight to where I worked, I wanted just to now go back to the original purpose of our webinar, which is legal interpreting. First of all, judiciary interpreters and translators facilitate communication for people with limited English proficiency who find it challenging to communicate in a legal setting. Legal translators must be thoroughly familiar with the language and functions of their country's judicial system, as well as other countries' legal systems. Court interpreters work in a variety of legal settings, such as attorney-client meetings, preliminary hearings, arraignments, depositions, and trials. Success as a court interpreter requires an understanding of both legal terminology and colloquial language. In addition to interpreting what is said, court interpreters also may be required to read written documents aloud in a language other than that in which they were written, a task known as sight translation. When I joined the ICTY, I had to sign a loyalty declaration, which basically means that I would not disclose any sensitive information that I learned during the course of my work. I was also advised by my senior colleague to write a diary of my activities, and at some point during first 2 years, I reached 140 A4 pages of just noting down what happened in my course of work. After that, due to the extensive and dynamic requirements of work, I simply stopped writing this diary, but it's unfortunate because I spent 13 years in ICTY, and of just these 2 years, I made 140 pages, so imagine how many pages I would write if I had kept the diary throughout the career. Now,
Wow, yeah.
As for ICTY languages, first of all, the accused had the right to speak and hear the language they understand and to have all relevant materials translated into that language. Majority people who spoke English, but everything was also interpreted into French because English and French were official languages of ICTY. So judges and prosecutors had to speak one of these two official languages. Although UN had or has 6 official languages. So English, French, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, and Russian. As for translation and interpretation, as I said, the 2 official languages of the tribunal were English and French, and all staff and judges must speak at least one of these 2 languages. In accordance to international human rights standards, all accused have a right to use their language, their native language in court. So the accused before the tribunal, I say spoke because the tribunal closed its doors at the end of 2017. So I basically speak in the past language. The accused before the tribunal spoke in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, which the ICTY commonly referred as BCS, and Albanian or Macedonian. As a consequence, all court proceedings were held in at least 3 or sometimes 4 languages, while the vast majority of its written documents were translated into anywhere from 2 to 5 languages. Interpreters who worked with the spoken word and translators who worked with the written text are therefore critical to practically every aspect of the tribunal's work. Each courtroom had several soundproof interpretation booths to provide simultaneous interpretation services for all the court participants and for the listening public. Interpreters worked in teams of 2 and interpreted for 30 minutes at one time, while our colleague provided backup. After 30 minutes, we switched. Interpreters must speak in the first person, making the words sound both natural and fluent, and we had to convey the wording used by those we interpreted with the greatest accuracy and neutrality. Any mistakes made in court were quickly acknowledged and rectified. Interpreters were also required to respect the confidentiality of the proceedings and strive for professional detachment at all times. We were part of the so-called conference and language service section, which belonged to the part of structure of tribunal called registry. We provided services neutrally to chambers, which means trial chambers, office of the prosecutor, defense counsels, and registry staff, which basically covered the whole logistical aspect of our work. There are 2 kinds of interpretation, as I'm sure the audience knows: simultaneous interpretation and consecutive interpretation. In simultaneous, the interpreter speaks at the same rate and only a few seconds behind the speaker. This type of interpretation requires special equipment, as we know, microphones and headsets. In consecutive interpretation, the interpreter starts speaking after the speaker stops. This kind of interpretation is used by the tribunal both in-house, for example, for meetings or interviews, or for field work where no interpretation equipment is available. During my course of work, I mainly acted as consecutive interpreter. As for the code of ethics, all the interpreters and translators of the ICTY were bound by the tribunal's code of ethics. We had the duty to maintain information we obtained in the course of our work confidential, even after we left the tribunal. When interpreting or translating communications between suspects or accused or their lawyers, the interpreters, we were bound by the rule of legal professional privilege, and we must not disclose any information we obtained without their express consent. We were required to act independently impartially and strive for professional detachment at all times. We must translate it accurately, and when working in courtrooms, we had to alert judges to any doubt arising from speakers' choice of words. We had to use also consistent terminology. But as for Code of Ethics, we just took one article of the 17 pages long document, which is hyperlinked here at the end of this slide. But as you can read, we were bound to only tell the truth and to completely transmit the message and the tone of the message. I'd like to just share one link with you, which is publicly available. This is the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal Code of Ethics, and all the details of our rules of engagement are defined here. As you can see, this document was created in 1999, and at that time there was obviously reason why there was need for such document. It was drafted by Chief Conference and Language Service Section, and it was revised by the Registrar of the ICTY. In comparison with AIIC code highlights the difference between court interpreting and conference interpreting. ICTY was a hybrid. We put emphasis on accuracy, truth, completeness, fidelity, neutrality, wording, and non-verbal clues. I'd like to share you some of my personal experiences from my work. I have several stories, but please feel free to interrupt at any moment if you want to ask me any questions, Caroline.
Yeah, I had a quick question just before you get going on the personal side.
Yes.
With the Code of Ethics, which is a fascinating document, it's really cool that it's available. And we'll be sharing this with all of our audience here, so you can look at it more in detail. But when you were sort of sworn in to the ICTY, what was the process in terms of complying with the Code of Ethics? What would happen if someone didn't comply? Were there punishments, or were they just automatically prohibited from interpreting?
First of all, I never ever heard of any such occurrence when someone basically broke the Code of Ethics, but we could even face trial because we were dealing with people's lives, and any of the word sentences translated, interpreted wrongly could impact someone's life tremendously.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, because it's literally life or death with this kind of thing. So it's kind of fascinating. Yeah, I was just curious. So you can continue.
Tribunal had a very, very strict procedure on employment, and I know that when we were applying for these jobs at the tribunal, we had to go through numerous security checks that were carried out behind our backs. We didn't know about these details, but later, through some of my personal connections, I learned that the tribunal checked background of its staff very thoroughly. Yes. So I'd like to share some of my personal stories from the very beginning. I was a very young man when I started business of interpretation. I was 22, but I started working for ICTY when I was 27. Still, I would say young. Today I'm 43, almost 44. And when I applied for ICTY, and when I came to an interview, after the interview, I was called and they told me that I didn't get the job. I was very sad, but interestingly, just 2 days after they called me to tell me that I didn't get the job, they called me again and they said, "Would you reconsider? We may offer you a job now." I said, "Sure, why not?" And I came. And then they told me that they basically had 6 candidates, and I ranked number 2. And the lady who ranked number 1, she basically tried to work in this setting. I think she had a witness of who was a rape victim, and she simply couldn't cope with it, and she resigned immediately. So that's how a place for me was opened. And then the very first day when I came to work, they told me to bring a big bag full of personal belongings because I'm going on a mission 10-day long. I went with experienced investigators and with another colleague interpreter to a place where terrible killings occurred in 1995. Some 1,000+ people were killed within few hours in the place called Pilica in the northern eastern part of Bosnia. And our mission was basically to interview all the members of one military unit that was involved in that terrible massacre. So we were speaking with 30 people, 30 members of a platoon that was guarding this facility and later was involved in these killings. And all these people were basically cowards who were negating their role in this massacre. They were somehow lying to us that they were at that particular time someplace else. And it was obvious that they were lying, but our task was just to take their statements and to somehow later face them with some documents. But amongst them, there was one guy who was their cook. So definitely he didn't carry a rifle and he didn't take part in any of the crimes. However, he was very rude and angry towards ICTY officers. He was basically yelling at us and telling us that we were against his people and that we are not impartial court and this and that. So at some point, this investigator who was patiently speaking with previous 30 members of the platoon who definitely took part in this crime, raised his voice. He stood up, raised his voice, and started telling him the following, and this is a quote. He said, "Who do you think you little..." I pardon my language. I just tell you what happened, and later I have to interpret that.
Yeah, of course. You're just interpreting it, right?
He said, "Who do you think, you little piece of shit? Who are you to question my integrity? I am the investigator of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and you were involved in the second largest massacre after the Second World War." And that guy simply, became afraid. But then I, as interpreter, also had to stand up and also had to raise my voice and also had to use these words and somehow make this witness, or I would say not accused but suspect, cooperate. And then he somehow started cooperating and answered all of our questions normally. But for me, I became a little afraid. I said to myself, my God, if I had to do this on a regular daily basis and live in this country and maybe see these people again and again, maybe they will attack me one day. Maybe this will not be good for my, safety. However, nothing ever happened to interpreters of ICTY, because all these criminals realized that we were just doing our job. So this is one story from my work. Later, I got courage that I simply just am an interpreter, and I simply transferred the message and the tone of the message, and there was no problems. I have another story. It was on many occasions I actually cried while doing my job. I cried for a number of reasons. First of all, people went through terrible sufferings, and on another occasion, some other people risked their lives to help others. When I say others, I mean people who were from the other side. Because back in times before 1992, people of Bosnia and Herzegovina were good neighbors and friends and respected each other, regardless of their ethnic background. But during the war, people were here divided by these ethnic lines and somehow or other forced into so-called feeling of being enemy to each other. At some point, there was a story of a witness who, she was an 18-year-old lady whose, I don't know if the audience will believe this. I had experiences when I said some of these stories to some of my friends in the United States. They didn't trust me. They thought I was lying. But trust me, all the time, going to tell you is absolute truth. So at one point, her village was completely destroyed, and she had 50 members of her family, and all the 50 members of her family were killed. She was kept because she was young and beautiful at that time. So at the age of 18, she was brought to a military base where this unit who killed her family members actually kept her as a slave. She had to cook for them. She had to clean their clothes. She had to even indulge in sexual relations with them. So basically, she was a rape victim for a period of almost 3 years and a half. So almost throughout the war, she had to do this. So just imagine, not just that you lose all the family members, but then that you had to go through such experiences during the war. So that military base was of course, somewhere in a remote area, and she completely felt unprotected during all these years. But at some point, one member of these peoples who did those crimes against her and her family, and that person was influential politician at that time in the area, he decided to help her, and he called her to clean his house. That was the justification, so that the military unit let her go. After she came to his house, he told her, my dear daughter, I didn't invite you here to use you to clean my house or to misuse you in any way. I actually brought you here to help you. I want to help you, but it's very difficult in this situation. So the only way to help you is to somehow convert you into my religion. And I'm purposely not giving any hints, so I want to avoid any kind of I do not want people to think that I'm speaking about particular people like Serbs, Croats, or Bosniaks. It doesn't really matter. The point is the stories that we interpreters had to be involved in and interpret. So that lady, being completely terrified with what she had gone through, of course, she accepted this deal, and the local priest said, this is not something that we do on a regular basis, and this is not something that God would be pleased with if it is done by force, but if it will save the life of this lady, we will do it. So they basically gave her a different name, and from that point, this local politician treated her as his daughter, basically. For a few months, that was okay, but then he said, my dear daughter, people learned about what I did, and they are now threatening me, and I think I have to relocate you to another safer location. And there, he drove her for about 50-40 kilometers somewhere, and said, from now on, you can go on your own and go to your own people. And at that point, she said, my dear father, thank you, but how can I thank you? What can I do for you? What is there anything I can do to repay you? And he only said, no, my dear daughter, but just tell this one day to someone. And then while taking statement from her, she said, today I have a husband, I have 2 children, nobody knows about this, and you are the first person I'm telling you this. At that moment, I started crying. It was a really emotional moment, and this witness later, under protective measures, testified in one of the trials. I will just tell two more quick stories. One time I was offered $1 million for the name of a perpetrator of one crime. There was a rich family whose father, rich family, basically 4 brothers. Their father was killed during the war, and their father was killed just because criminals knew that he was a rich man. So they were torturing him in terrible ways to get money from him, and finally they got it. So in the course of my work, I had the opportunity to meet these perpetrators, but now we were speaking with victims. We spoke with the sons of this late father, and these sons, they were again rich people. They owned many businesses in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and at some point they told me during one of our breaks, if you give me the name of this guy who killed my father, I'll give you $1 million. So this is another thing that may come under code of ethics. I simply told him, sir, I'm basically not allowed to speak with you at all during breaks. I'm here just to interpret, and I cannot consider this offer. Basically, I had to report it to my colleague who was at this point investigator. So that was handled that way, and of course I reported it to my superiors in the office back when I came back to the office. Another similar offer came from another military commander who at some point became rich owner of a automobile company, and at some time he offered not just me but the prosecutor and the investigator 3 brand new Toyota Land Cruisers if we just put his testimony somehow under carpet, if you know what I mean. Of course, we just laughed at it and carried on with our work because that was completely unacceptable and completely out of question. Yeah, these were some of my personal stories. I'd like to continue with the presentation. Soon we will finish.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those. We got just a few comments here from the audience, you know, just expressing how much respect they have and how much they admire the work you've done, and you know, just saying that they've also cried during assignments, so you're not alone.
Thank you for telling me that. I like my job. I will always like it because it gives me the opportunity to feel the people's feelings somehow and to transmit those feelings. Because if I don't understand the feeling, I cannot transmit it. And
exactly. I mean, you're quite literally giving somebody who is unable a voice. So
yeah.
It's incredibly important.
Yes. As you see on this slide, it's just a hypothesis that is there any consistent difference in the way interpreters interpret defendants and victims? Well, I think ICTY interpreters always did their job, which means basically just interpret it. We never take sides, and I have here a document which is also publicly available. On slide, it's a little bit smaller and it's difficult to see, but I'd like to open it from a browser. That document is something that was at some point, as you see here, confidential document. It was a plan of trial chambers visit to locations of war crimes in Bosnia. In the case of Radovan Karadzic, prosecutor versus Radovan Karadzic, one of the main person indicted for war crimes, who was the president of Republika Srpska. And as you see in this document, that document basically later became, as you see here, public on 24th May 2011. And as you see here, the members of this site visit were trial chamber judges, then their associates, investigator, prosecutor, then defense counsel, and other members of the management and support services. And I, as a registry interpreter, basically served them all equally, impartially, and we visited, as you see, many locations in different parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina where some terrible crimes occurred. All these locations were presented to the trial chamber in the courtroom, and then later at the end of trial they had to go and visit these places and see what happened everywhere. This was a long site visit. At the end we visited 72 locations, and yeah. So we go back to our presentation. At the end of every witness statement or suspect statement, accused statement, an interpreter had to certify with the signature that, for example, you can see some of my statements that I found on the internet. The names of these people are publicly available, but I redacted them here because they don't mean nothing to the audience. But we had to declare that we are duly qualified and approved by the Registry of International Criminal Tribunal to interpret from the Bosnian language in this case. And in this case, on the right, you can see to interpret from the Serbo-Croatian language. So sometimes, depending on an interlocutor, a witness or accused or perpetrator who came from different parts of former Yugoslavia, we had to adjust the dialect and language. And then in these interpreter certifications, sometimes it was written Bosnian language, sometimes Croatian, sometimes Serbian, sometimes Serbo-Croatian. And at the end, we had to confirm that that person has acknowledged that all the facts and matters set out in this statement, as translated or interpreted by me, were true to the best of his or her knowledge and recollection, and has accordingly signed where it was indicated. And then I had to sign, as you see. So we are coming to the end of this presentation. I'm very proud that I contributed to this historical institution, which had numerous achievements, and as you see, one of them was to end the impunity of leaders. Some leaders thought that justice may never reach them, and these leaders were presidents, even presidents of countries, ministers, local civilian leaders, commanders. Also, one of the greatest achievements of ICTY is that we gave voice to the victims. They finally could tell what happened to them, and almost 4,000 witnesses testified before tribunal. Most of these witnesses we had to prepare prior to going to the court. And one of the achievements also is that of all 161 indictments, all of the individuals were finally tried. Some last few are waiting their final judgments, but all of them were sentenced from the first instance court, and some had the opportunity to appeal. And you can see some of the facts here. People were sent to serve sentences in 14 different states. Some of the 161 individuals that were indicted, 13 of them actually were sent back to the local courts that ICTY helped establish. And here we have the more precise information. So more than 4,000 witnesses testified, more than almost 11,000 trial days, and 2.5 million pages of transcript was created. The ICTY was prosecuting 4 types of crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, violations of the laws and customs of war, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. At the very end, I'd like to show another video, And then if the audience has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Is that okay?
Sounds good. Yep.
They said that there never would be any indictees.
Nisam kriv I nisam učestvovao ni u jednom od djela kojim sam stavio za optužnicu.
And then they said there would never be any trials.
Malheureusement, nous n'avons qu'une salle d'audience et donc nous devrons la partager avec les autres procès qui sont en cours. Le tribunal est très chargé en ce moment.
And then they said there would never be any convictions.
Vous êtes donc coupable général Krstić de génocide.
And there would never be any sentencing.
For the foregoing reasons, the appeal chamber imposes a sentence of life imprisonment.
Nearly 25 years later, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is proud of having dismantled the tradition of impunity for war crimes around the world.
The message now is much clearer, as I said. There's no longer impunity. And this is, in my opinion, the greatest, the most fundamental, the most important legacy of the ICTY.
In 1999, the tribunal became the first ever international court to indict a sitting head of state for crimes committed during an ongoing armed conflict.
On May 22nd, I presented an indictment for confirmation against Slobodan Milosevic and 4 others, charging them with crimes against humanity.
I consider this tribunal a false tribunal and indictments false indictments. Mr. Milosevic, you are now before this tribunal and you're within the jurisdiction of it.
Over the years, the ICTY has adjudicated facts in cases of more than 100 accused individuals, many of them high-ranking politicians, military or police officers.
They never dreamed that one day they would answer for these crimes. They would be brought before a court of law. That has been a great achievement.
Of the 161 persons indicted by the tribunal today, none remain at large.
It sends a very strong signal throughout the world that international criminal justice is achievable.
In more than 7,000 trial days, ICTY judges received and evaluated evidence about thousands of crimes committed during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia.
But one of the results of this is that we have
one of the most completely documented incidents of mass violence in the history of humanity.
More than 4,000 witnesses testified about some of the most harrowing experiences of their lives and helped to establish the most complete oral history of the conflicts.
If people didn't have bravery and courage to come forward, the place would not function at all. It's as simple as that.
What we have learned from our witnesses so far is that they testify so their story can be heard, so the world knows what happened.
You know, one of its achievements very early on, in a way more so early on, was this narrative for the annals of history. Whether history cared to listen or not is another matter. But the story was told of what happened.
The testimony and the evidence enabled ICTY's judges to create a modern-day understanding of international criminal justice.
There's been more jurisprudence out of our tribunal in 5 years than in the past 500 years from international criminal courts.
That is quite a remarkable achievement, especially if you think back to the way in which the tribunal was created as a gesture by the UN Security Council, really.
International and domestic courts will continue building upon the legal legacy of the ICTY. The established facts will be used in trials in the former Yugoslavia for many years to come.
Kada je sud Bosne i Hercegovine 2005. godine osnovao odjel za ratne zločine, mogu sa zadovoljstvom reći da je u regiji prvi počeo primjenjivati praksu Haškog tribunala u svojim odlukama.
Despite its humble beginnings, the ICTY's prosecutors, defense counsel, and judges demonstrated that the international criminal justice can be attained. Whatever political realities the future brings, this lesson will not be unlearned.
Okay. Are we there?
Yes, wow, thank you. So let me just check here to see if we have any questions.
I just want to add one more sentence. And that is that you will now see on the internet the tremendous work of the tribunal that you've seen in these two videos could not be reached without the assistance of interpreters. And the ICTY language services receives in 2017 an award which glorified the work of its interpreters. So we are very proud that we were part of this historical institutions and contributed to world justice. Thank you very much.